Apache woman tied as prey for wolves. Allow for halls. Cowboy found her and refused to leave her behind. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The wind rolled down from the north, sharp and dry, cutting through the high desert without slowing. The light was thin, the kind that comes late in the day when the sun has already given up its warmth. The ground was hard from frost in the shaded spots, and the smell in the air carried dust, cold, and something faintly sour, meat maybe or fur. Nellie stood against a cedar post driven deep into the slope. The post was old, split down one side, but solid enough to hold her weight. Her wrists were tied high above her head, the rope biting deep into her skin until her hands were numb. Her ankles were bound close together, forcing her to stand straight. The cotton dress she wore, once earth-colored but now stained with dust and grit, was torn at the side, showing the hard line of her thigh, and the low neckline sat uneven, bearing more than she wanted. Her breathing was shallow, partly from the cold, partly from the effort to keep her fear under control. She had been here for hours. Her shoulders throbbed, her calves cramped, and her fingers burned from the lack of blood. Every time she shifted to ease the strain, the rope cut tighter. Wolves moved in the brush, keeping low, their bodies blending into the dry grass and scrub. She could hear their paws in the dirt when the wind went still. They were waiting. Nayeli had been left here as punishment. The details didn't matter to those who tied her up. A cousin's grudge, a false story told to the wrong men. The truth wasn't enough to save her. No one from her band would come for her. That knowledge settled in her chest like a cold stone. She had decided she would not cry, and she would not beg. If this was the way she died, she would face it standing. Far to the south, Luke Harlan was working his way through a series of low washes, heading toward the canyon rim before nightfall. He wasn't headed anywhere important. He never was anymore. Years back, he'd scouted for the cavalry, riding ahead of columns, finding water holes and passes. It had been work for pay, nothing more. But it had left him with too many memories of the things men do to each other when no one is watching. After the war, he buried his wife, sold what little land they had, and took to drifting with his horse and what he could carry. Today he was out because moving felt better than sitting in a room alone. He'd been riding the Badlands most of the afternoon, checking an old trapping route he'd once used. That was when the wind carried the sound, low, stretched out howls, wolves, and close. It wasn't unusual, but there was something in the way the calls overlapped that made him pull the reins and listen. It sounded like the pack was focused on one point. He nudged his horse north, keeping the rifle loose in the scabbard. The ridgeline came into view, the cedar post standing out against the gray sky. At first, she was just a shape, thin, upright, unmoving. Then the torn dress caught his eye, the ropes, the dark hair moving in the wind. He stopped 100 yards out. The wolves were inside 50, pacing in half circles, testing how close they could get. He eased the Winchester free, worked the lever, and sighted on the dirt just in front of the nearest wolf. The shot cracked across the ridge, echoing hard against the rock. The animal skidded back, startled, then turned and loped into the brush. Another was still too close. Luke chambered a second round and sent the bullet over its head. The pack broke apart, fading into the low ground. When it was quiet again, he dismounted, keeping the rifle in his right hand. His boots made a steady crunch on the frozen soil. He scanned the ridge, the brush, the horizon. He wasn't in the mood for trouble, but trouble was already here. Up close, she looked younger than he first thought. Her face was drawn tight, but her eyes were sharp, watching him, measuring him, not sure yet if he was better than the men who left her here. Luke slid the rifle onto his shoulder and drew the knife from his belt. He stepped in close enough to smell the dust and sweat on her. The blade went under the rope at her wrists, and he saw the skin split in red lines as the tension gave way. Her arms dropped, but she almost fell with them, the weight of her own body too much after standing so long. He caught her before she hit the ground, one arm around her waist. She was warm despite the cold air. She didn't speak, but her jaw tightened, and she pulled away from his grip as soon as she could stand. Luke crouched and cut at the rope at her ankles, then stepped back to give her space. He didn't like crowding people. He took his canteen from the saddle and offered it. She hesitated, then drank, the water running down her chin in small rivulets. He took his coat from the back of the saddle and draped it over her shoulders. She looked at it for a moment before pulling it close. The wolves were still out there. He could hear them moving, keeping a wide circle now. He tilted his head toward the horse. She understood. He lifted her into the saddle, swung up behind her, and took the reins. His arm came around her, not in comfort, but to make sure she stayed steady. They moved off the ridge at a slow, sure pace. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the creak of leather, the steady rhythm of the horse's steps, and the wind cutting through the sage. Luke didn't know where she came from or why she'd been left to die. She didn't know what kind of man had just pulled her down from the post. For now, it was enough that the cedar post was behind them, and the wolves were falling away into the dark. Luke kept the horse at an even pace, careful on the uneven ground as the last of the daylight bled out across the horizon. The cold was already pressing harder, and he could feel Nayeli's weight leaning back against him more with each mile. She hadn't said a word since he cut her loose, but her breathing told him enough. Oh, shallow at first, then deeper as the distance from the cedar post grew. She was still running the same question through her head he'd seen in her eyes. Who was he, and what did he want? When the trail dipped into a narrow wash, the wind eased. Luke used the quiet to check behind them. No wolves, no riders, only the long stretch of sage and rock. He knew leaving the post upright would bother him, but night was coming, and there was no sense in risking it twice in one day. He could deal with that later. You hurt anywhere? His voice was low, even, meant not to startle her. She shook her head once, her hand staying inside the coat he'd given her, clutching it tight. That coat had seen a lot of years. Buffalo hide lining, one torn pocket sewn shut with twine, and it was warm enough to keep her from shaking in the saddle. Another half-mile brought them to a narrow canyon mouth, where a thin line of smoke trailed up into the cold air. His cabin sat tucked against the rock face, its back wall built right into the stone for shelter. A small corral, empty now, lay to the left, and a pile of cut wood was stacked neatly under a tarp near the door. He swung down first, then held his hands out to steady her when she slid from the saddle. Her legs buckled at the first step, but she caught herself before he had to grab her. She stood there, breathing slow, eyes moving over the place. No questions yet, just taking in the layout like she needed to know every corner. Inside, the cabin was simple but solid. A bed along the far wall, a narrow table with 2 chairs, shelves lined with a few jars of beans and coffee, a pot hanging over the small stove. He pushed the door shut against the wind, set the latch, and took his hat off. Sit, he said, nodding toward the bed. She hesitated but stepped over, lowering herself carefully. Her hands stayed under the coat, fingers curling into the lining like it was the first solid thing she'd had hold of in days. Luke filled a tin cup from the water bucket and handed it to her. This time she took it without hesitation. He could see the rope burns clearly now, dark lines around her wrists, swollen and raw. He set his rifle against the wall, then dug into a small box under the table and brought out a strip of clean cloth and a half bottle of whiskey. This will sting. He poured a little over the cloth and gently pressed it to her wrist. She flinched, jaw tightening, but didn't pull away. He worked on the other wrist the same way, keeping his hand steady. When he was done, he wrapped both with fresh strips. She watched him through it all, saying nothing. He could feel the weight of her questions, how he'd found her, why he'd stopped, what he expected now. He didn't push her to speak. I was running traps south of here, he said finally, answering at least one of them. Heard the wolves. They were too close together to be hunting their own. Figured something was keeping them in one spot. He met her eyes. Didn't expect to find you. Her gaze dropped to the floor. After a long pause, she said, "You could have left me." The words were flat, not a challenge, just a fact. I could have, he agreed. Didn't seem right. That was all for now. He stepped to the stove, lit it, and set a small pot of beans to warm. The cabin filled with the smell, and her eyes followed him as he moved. When he slid a plate toward her a few minutes later, she hesitated again, then ate in small, steady bites, like she didn't want to waste any of it. When the meal was done, Luke pulled a blanket from the shelf and set it beside her on the bed. "You take this tonight, I'll take the floor." Her eyes flicked to him again, searching for any sign of a price in his voice. There was none. He spread his coat out near the door, sat with his back to the wall, and began checking his rifle by the light of the small lamp. In the quiet, the sound of the wind outside came and went. She lay back slowly, pulling the blanket to her chin. He could see her eyes open in the dim light, still watching him, still waiting to decide what kind of man he was. Luke knew it would take more than one night for her to trust him. That was fine. He'd been alone a long time, long enough to know some things couldn't be rushed. Tomorrow, maybe she'd tell him who left her out there. Maybe not. But tonight, she was alive. The door was barred, and the wolves were far off. That would do. Luke woke before first light, as he always did. The cabin was cold, the stove gone to embers during the night. He moved quietly, stoking the fire back to life, the scrape of metal on iron the only sound. He didn't look toward the bed until the flames caught. She was awake. He could tell by the way her body stayed still, but her eyes tracked him from the shadow. "You sleep?" he asked. "A little," she said. Her voice was low, edged with caution, as if she wasn't sure how much of herself to give to any answer. He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and set one on the table near her. She hesitated but sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders, and moved to sit across from him. Her hair was loose, dark strands falling forward as she cupped the warm tin. Luke had learned not to force talk, but there were things he needed to know. Not for curiosity, but because a woman left tied to a post didn't get there by accident, and danger rarely stayed in one place. "You said I could have left you," he began. "That means you know someone might still be looking to finish it." Her eyes met his briefly, then shifted to the steam rising from her cup. "Yes." He waited. "My cousin," she said after a pause. "He wanted my father's rifle after he died. I wouldn't give it. He told the others I was trading with men outside our band, said I brought shame." Her jaw tightened. Some believed him. Some didn't care if it was true. Luke didn't react beyond a slight narrowing of his eyes. "And they left you for the wolves." She nodded once. "It's not the first time someone's been left that way, but it's the first time for me." That answered one question for him, why she'd been out there, but it raised another. If your cousin hears you're alive, will he try again? She didn't hesitate. "Yes, he'll want me gone before anyone asks why he lied." Luke set his cup down. "Then we'll make sure he doesn't find you." The words were plain, said like a plan, not a promise. After breakfast, bread torn from a small loaf and the rest of the beans from the night before, Luke handed her a pair of wool socks and an old wool shirt that would hang loose on her. She accepted both without comment and changed in the corner while he stepped outside to check the horse. The sun was coming over the canyon rim now, throwing a pale yellow light across the flats. Fresh tracks cut through the frost near the corral. 2 sets of hoof prints. Luke crouched to study them. They hadn't been there yesterday. Whoever made them had ridden through in the night, close enough to see smoke from the chimney if they were looking. When he came back in, she saw his face change. "Riders?" she asked. "2," he said. "Didn't stop, but they passed close." She stood a little straighter. If it's them, he said, "they'll know I'm here now." He picked up his rifle from where it leaned against the wall and began checking the action. "That means we're not moving around alone for a while." She watched him work, and there was something in her eyes now, less guarded, more measuring. She was deciding if she could believe that he meant to keep her safe or if this was just a temporary shelter until he tired of the risk. Luke didn't say what he was thinking, but the truth was simple. He'd spent too many years doing nothing for anyone, and that ended yesterday when he cut her down. He showed her where the water bucket sat, where the spare cartridges were kept, and how to slide the bolt on the door if someone came while he was outside. She listened closely, memorizing each step. By midday, the frost was gone from the ground. They worked side by side, splitting wood. She swung the axe with controlled effort, every motion showing she'd done hard work before. At one point, she caught him watching and said, "You think I can't?" "I think you can," he said simply, and went back to his own pile. When the light started to fade, Luke made a slow circle out past the corral, scanning the horizon. No riders in sight, but the tracks from the morning stayed fresh in his mind. Inside, she had the stove lit and a pot of rabbit stew warming. The smell filled the cabin, making the place feel less like a stopover and more like a home. They ate in silence until she set her spoon down. "Why were you really in the Badlands?" she asked, her eyes fixed on him now. "Habit," he answered. "I go where it's quiet, no one to answer to." "Then why answer to me?" Luke held her gaze for a long moment. "Because leaving you there would have made me no better than the ones who tied you up." She didn't speak after that, but her eyes softened in a way he hadn't seen yet. That night, when he took his place on the floor, she didn't just watch him from the bed. She said quietly, "Good night, Luke." It was the first time she'd said his name, and that, to him, was worth more than any thanks. The morning came with a stillness that didn't sit right with Luke. No wind, no distant calls from the coyotes, no movement in the brush beyond the corral. In his experience, quiet like that meant something was nearby, watching. He was already at the stove, pouring coffee, when Nayeli stirred. She sat up on the bed, hair loose over her shoulders, the blanket slipping low enough to show the bruising along her collarbone, marks he hadn't seen clearly before. He set the mug on the table for her. "Those from the rope?" he asked. "Some," she said, pulling the blanket tighter. "Some from before." He didn't push for details. He knew what she meant. The rope burns were from the post, but the deeper bruises, the ones yellowing at the edges, were older. He filed it away without showing what he felt. In his mind, it was one more thing her cousin and his men would answer for if they came back. While they ate the bread and jerky left from the day before, Luke brought up the riders who had passed in the night 2 days ago. "If they were your cousin's men, they might be circling to see if you were still alive. You ever seen them ride together?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "One has a scar down the left cheek. The other wears a blue army coat, even in the heat." That was something Luke could use. He'd keep those details in mind if they crossed paths. He'd learned long ago that remembering a man's code or the way he carried himself could mean the difference between spotting trouble at 100 yards or too late to do anything about it. After breakfast, Luke brought his saddle and tack into the cabin to oil. "If we're going to get supplies," he said, "we'll go together. No reason for you to stay here alone." She didn't argue, which told him she'd already thought through the same risks he had. She stepped outside with him while he saddled the horse. The frost crunched under her moccasins, and she pulled his coat tighter around her. Her eyes kept scanning the open ground, as if she expected to see riders crest the horizon. The trail to the small trading post was narrow, winding through scrub and shallow washes. They didn't speak much, but Luke noticed the way she kept her head high, even when they passed open stretches, refusing to look hunted, even if part of her still felt that way. At the post, Luke traded for flour, salt, lamp oil, and a coil of thin rope. He caught the storekeeper's eye flick toward Nayeli more than once. Luke didn't like it, but he kept his voice steady when he asked for the last item, a small bolt of cotton cloth. Back outside, Nayeli said quietly, "Men look at me like they already know my worth." Luke adjusted the strap of the flour sack on the saddle. "Then they're looking wrong. What they think doesn't change what's true." He didn't say more, but she seemed to take something from it. On the way back, they stopped at a narrow creek to water the horse. Luke noticed her hands when she bent to scoop water. They were rough from rubber rope and work, but steady. "You handle a rifle?" he asked. "Yes," he nodded toward the saddle. "Then you'll carry it when we ride. Trouble sees an armed rider. It thinks twice." She didn't smile, but there was a small shift in her expression. Pride, maybe, or relief at not being treated like someone to hide away. They reached the cabin just as the light was fading. Luke walked the perimeter before they went inside, checking for fresh tracks. There were none, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left him. Inside, while she unpacked the flour and cloth, he set the rifle within reach of the table. That night, after the stew was finished and the lamplight had turned the cabin into a small pocket of warmth in the dark, she spoke from the bed. "If my cousin comes, will you send me away?" "No," Luke said without looking up from the oil rag he was working into the rifle stock. "If he comes, I'll deal with him here." She was quiet a long time before saying, "Then I'll stay." It wasn't a promise of trust yet, but it was the first time she'd said she was staying by choice. For Luke, that was enough to know he'd made the right decision the moment he cut her down from that post. The wind had shifted overnight, carrying the smell of wood smoke from somewhere it shouldn't be. Luke noticed it the moment he stepped outside at first light. It wasn't from their chimney. This was thinner. carried from a distance, and the way it drifted told him it came from the south near the ridge. He didn't like it. Smoke in that direction meant someone was camping where no one usually did. Nellie was already awake, sitting at the table with the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She watched him lace his boots and said, "Something's wrong." "Maybe," Luke answered, keeping his voice even. "Stay inside while I check." He saddled the horse without hurry, but with purpose. Before he mounted, he took the second rifle from the wall and set it on the table next to her, loaded, bolt smooth. "If someone comes through that door who isn't me, you don't wait for them to talk." She met his eyes for a long second, then nodded. The ride toward the ridge was slow, Luke keeping to the low ground. He spotted the camp before he got within rifle range. Two horses tied to a pinyon pine. Their riders crouched near a small fire. Even at a distance, he saw what he'd hoped not to. A man in a blue army coat and another with a pale scar running from the cheekbone to the jaw. He stayed low, circled wide, and returned without being seen. By the time he pushed the door open, Nellie was standing just inside, rifle in hand, watching the gap under the door as if she could read trouble in the light. "They're here," Luke said simply. "Your cousin's men. They're camped by the ridge." Her jaw clenched. "If they're here, he's close. Maybe, or maybe he sent them to see if you're still breathing." Luke set his hat on the table. "Either way, we're not giving them the advantage. From now on, you don't step outside without me." For the rest of the morning, they worked as if it were any other day, splitting wood, patching the edge of the roof. But both kept an ear tuned for hoofbeats. Luke explained small things she hadn't known yet about the cabin. Where the second door was in the back wall, built low and hidden by brush. How the shelves on the far side could be pulled down to block the windows in minutes. She listened closely, committing every word to memory. Around midday, Luke handed her his knife. "Show me how you use it." She didn't hesitate. She took a stance, blade held firm, and moved with quick, short strikes. No wasted motion. It told him she'd been taught before, maybe by her father. When they came back inside, the air between them felt different. She wasn't just someone he'd pulled from a post. She was becoming a part of the cabin's defense, part of its rhythm. That night, the wind came up again, rattling the shutters. They ate in silence until she finally asked the thing that had been sitting between them since the start. "Why help me? You don't know me. You don't know." Luke set his spoon down. "I've seen too many left to die because nobody wanted the trouble. I'm not doing that again." She studied him, as if deciding whether to believe the plainness of the answer. "And if I bring trouble to your door?" He looked at her without hesitation. "Then I deal with it." Her eyes softened just a little, enough for him to see that something in her had shifted. It wasn't trust yet, not completely, but it was closer than it had been when he first cut her down. When he bedded down on the floor that night, she didn't just watch him from the shadows. She said quietly, "I'm glad you came when you did." Luke lay back, listening to the wind outside, and thought to himself that, for the first time in a long while, he was glad he'd come too. By morning, the wind had died, but the air carried a damp cold that sank straight into the bones. Luke stepped outside to split wood, scanning the horizon out of habit. That's when he saw them. Two riders in the distance, moving slow, too far for details, but close enough to know they were headed his way. They weren't taking the direct trail. They were angling in, using the low draws for cover. That alone told him enough. He went back inside without making a sound that might carry. Nayeli was at the table braiding her hair. She looked up, reading his face before he spoke. "They're coming." He took his rifle down from the wall and set it on the table. "Your cousin's men, scar on the cheek, army coat, exactly how you said." Her hands stilled. "If they see me, they'll send word to him. He'll come." "Then they're not going to see you," Luke said. He pulled the blanket from the bed and tossed it to her. "Go to the back crawl space. Stay low. Don't come out until I tell you." "I can shoot," she reminded him, her voice edged. "I know, but right now I need them thinking you're gone, not holed up here." She studied him for a second, like she wanted to argue, but then she nodded and moved to the hidden back door. Before she slipped through, she asked, "What will you tell them?" "The truth," he said, "that you're not here. They just won't know why." Luke stepped back outside, leaving the door half open, as if he had nothing to hide. By the time the riders reached the corral, he was leaning against a fence post. Hat low, hands resting easy but close enough to his gun to matter. The man with the scar gave a tight smile. Heard you've been seen with a woman, Apache, about yay high, black hair. Luke shrugged. Haven't had company in months. You might want to check your sources. The man in the army coat shifted in the saddle, scanning the cabin. We know she was out near the ridge. We know she didn't walk away on her own. Luke's eyes stayed steady. You calling me a liar? Neither answered, but their horses twitched under the silence. Luke let it stretch until the air felt tight. Then he pushed off the fence. I don't know what you've been told, but you're not going to find what you're looking for here. Best turn around while the trail's still open. Scar's smile faded. We'll be back, he said flatly. Maybe with more men. Bring whoever you want, Luke replied. Won't change the answer. They turned their horses slow, making sure he saw they weren't in a hurry. When they disappeared over the rise, Luke stayed put another 10 minutes, watching the trail until he was sure they weren't circling back. Inside, Nayeli emerged from the crawl space, brushing dust from her dress. They'll tell him, she said quietly. Probably, Luke agreed, setting the rifle back on the wall. Means we've got days, maybe less, before he decides what to do. She stood there a moment, her eyes holding his. You could still tell me to leave. I could, Luke said, but I'm not going to. For the first time, she didn't look away. Then I'll fight with you when they come. He gave a short nod. He'd been alone for years, and now he realized something had shifted. He wasn't planning only for himself anymore, and from the way she squared her shoulders, neither was she. The next 2 days passed with an edge that neither of them had to name. Luke kept the rifle close no matter where he was, propped against the table when he ate, resting against his knee when he sat by the stove, laid across the saddle horn when he checked the far fence line. Nayeli stayed busy inside, mending a shirt of his, cutting the bolt of cloth he'd traded for, but her eyes kept flicking to the window as if expecting movement. By the morning of the third day, Luke saw the dust first, a column of it rolling low over the flats, moving in their direction. One rider out front, two behind, and another pair spread wide on either side. That was no casual approach. It was a sweep. He counted 5 horses total. The man in front rode straight-backed, confident. Even from this distance, Luke guessed it was her cousin. He stepped back inside. Oh, they're here. Nayeli rose from the table without asking who. She had her moccasins on and the rifle in her hands before he could speak again. I'm not hiding this time, she said. Luke studied her, then gave a short nod. All right, but you stay behind me until I tell you different. They stepped out together. The riders closed the distance until the man in front reined in about 30 yards from the cabin. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his hair bound with leather. The confidence in his face wasn't the empty kind. This was a man used to giving orders and getting them followed. He looked from Luke to Nayeli and smiled without warmth. I see the wolves didn't finish what they started. Luke's voice was flat. They had better things to do. The cousin's eyes narrowed slightly before settling back on Nayeli. You've caused trouble enough. Come down from there, and I'll forget the insult. She took a step forward, rifle steady in her hands. You lied. You took my father's rifle and said I sold myself to outsiders. I won't go anywhere with you. Luke kept his focus on the cousin's men, watching their hands. That rifle she's talking about. Still got it? The cousin tilted his head. It's mine now, passed to me when she was cast out. That's not how she tells it, Luke said. And if you came here for it, you're leaving without it. Scarface shifted in the saddle, eyes on Luke's hands. The man in the army coat slowly slid a hand toward his sidearm. Luke saw it but didn't move. Not yet. The cousin's smile returned, thinner this time. You'd stand for her, even knowing the trouble it'll bring? Luke's answer was calm. I'm already standing. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the cousin leaned forward in the saddle. We'll be back, he said, voice low. And when we do, you'll wish you'd given her up. Luke didn't flinch. Bring more men if you want. Won't change how it ends. The cousin turned his horse without another word. His men followed, but the message was clear. They weren't finished. When the dust finally settled, Luke lowered the rifle. Nayeli stood beside him, her jaw tight but her hands steady. They'll come at night, she said. Maybe, Luke replied, but now we know it's him, and now he knows we're ready. Inside, he set the rifle back on the wall but within easy reach. They worked together through the rest of the day, boarding the shutters and stacking wood inside. The air between them felt different, not just caution, but an unspoken agreement. Whatever was coming next, they'd face it side by side. The air that night carried no wind, no sound from the coyotes, no shift in the trees, just the kind of stillness Luke had learned to trust as a warning. The fire in the stove was low, casting a soft orange glow across the cabin walls. Luke sat at the table, cleaning his rifle for the third time that day, not because it needed it, but because he wanted it ready without question. Naeli sat on the edge of the bed, checking the rounds in the spare Winchester he'd given her earlier. Neither spoke much. The quiet between them was measured, not awkward. She broke it first. "My father's rifle," she said. "It was a Springfield. He told me it would be mine when I was old enough. My cousin took it the day after the burial. Told everyone I was unfit to keep it." Luke looked up. "That why you didn't just run when they tied you to that post?" "I ran once," she said flatly. "They caught me. I knew if I left again without it, I'd lose the last thing of him I had." He nodded once, tucking that piece away. It told him the rifle wasn't just property. It was her line in the sand. Near midnight, the sound came. Faint at first. Hooves on frozen soil. Careful, trying not to carry. Luke moved to the window, lifted one shutter just enough to see the moonlit flats. Shapes moved low against the ground. 5 riders again, but spread wider now, trying to come in from different angles. "They're here," he said. Naeli crossed to the table, her rifle in hand, eyes sharp. "Do we wait for them to get close?" "We let them get close enough to think they've got us," Luke answered. "Then we make sure they don't get any closer." He doused the lamp, leaving only the dim light from the stove. They took positions, Luke at the front window, Naeli covering the side approach. The sound of hoofbeats grew until it was just beyond the yard. A voice carried low from the dark. "Luke Harland." The cousin's tone was calm, almost friendly. "Last chance to hand her over. No need for anyone to get hurt." Luke raised his voice enough to carry. "You've already done your hurting. Won't be any here tonight." Silence. Then the cousin's voice again, sharper now. "Then we take her." That was when the first shadow moved in the yard. Luke fired once, the report cracking through the night. A man dropped from his saddle, hitting the dirt hard. Hooves scrambled. Naeli's shot followed a second later from the side of the cabin. Another rider cursed loudly and pulled back. The cousin stayed mounted in the dark. "You think you can shoot your way out of this?" "Not thinking," Luke said. "Just doing." 2 more shots rang out. Luke's and Naeli's, both clean, controlled. Another horse bolted, riderless. The remaining 2 shapes pulled back toward the ridge, regrouping. The cousin's silhouette lingered a moment longer, then turned and rode into the dark. Luke kept the rifle steady until the sound of hooves faded completely. Only then did he lower it. Inside, Naeli stood, breathing hard but steady, the rifle still in her hands. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Not tonight," Luke replied. "And next time, they'll know we're not the easy mark they thought." He closed the shutters, stoked the fire, and poured 2 cups of water. When he set hers on the table, she looked at him in a way that was different than before, not just trust, but a quiet certainty. "You didn't have to fight for me," she said. Luke met her gaze. "Yeah, I did." For the first time since he'd cut her down from that post, she let herself smile. Small, tired, but real. And for Luke, that was enough to know they'd just turned a corner neither of them would step back from. The morning after the fight, the ground outside the cabin told the whole story. Hoof prints gouged deep into the frozen dirt, patches of churned-up soil where men had fallen, a trail leading off toward the ridge where the survivors had retreated. Luke studied it in the cold light, noting how the track split. 3 riders breaking south, 2 heading west. The cousin hadn't gone far. The pattern showed they'd camped somewhere in the low draws, likely regrouping. He knew if they weren't dealt with now, they'd keep coming until one side was gone. Inside, Naeli was at the table, cleaning the rifle she'd used the night before. Her hands moved steady, the kind of focus that meant she'd been up for hours, thinking through the same thing Luke had. This wasn't over. When he came bombed back in, she looked up. "You're going after them." "Not we," Luke said. "Me." Her eyes narrowed. You think I'm going to sit here waiting to hear if you come back? No, he didn't argue long. He knew she was right. If her cousin saw her standing against him with a rifle in her hands, it would finish the thing in a way Luke couldn't alone. They rode out just after sunrise, following the south trail. The wind cut sharp across the flats, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. Within an hour, they spotted it, a small camp tucked against a rock wall, 3 horses tied nearby. 2 men were warming their hands at the fire. The third sat apart, the Springfield rifle across his lap. Nellie's breath caught when she saw it. "That's his," she said, voice low but firm. Luke slowed the horse. "We get the rifle. We end this here." They dismounted 100 yards out and moved in on foot, keeping to the rocks. At 30 yards, Luke stepped out first, rifle raised. "Set the rifle down and step away from the fire." The men froze. The cousin looked up slowly, his expression caught between surprise and defiance. "You should have stayed in your cabin, Harlan." "Maybe," Luke said, "but I don't like waiting for trouble to knock twice." Nayeli came out from behind the rocks then, rifle leveled, eyes locked on her cousin. "The rifle. Now." He laughed once, short and sharp. "You think you can take it from me?" "I don't think," she said. "I know." Something in her voice made him pause. Slowly, he set the Springfield on the ground and stepped back. His men shifted, but one look from Luke's rifle kept them in place. Nally stepped forward, picked up the rifle, and checked the chamber before slinging it over her shoulder. "My father," she said simply. Luke kept his eyes on the cousin. "You're done here. You come within 10 miles of that cabin again. You won't ride away." For a long moment, no one moved. Then the cousin gave a slow nod, anger tight in his jaw. "You've made your choice," he said to Nally. "Don't expect to come back." "I'm not coming back," she answered. "I have a home now." They backed away, keeping the rifles up until the men were mounted and riding hard in the opposite direction. When the sound of hooves faded, Luke let out the breath he'd been holding. The ride back was quiet but lighter somehow. The Springfield rested across Nally's lap, her hand on the stock like it was something alive. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was low and the light was warm against the canyon wall. Inside, Luke set the fire going while she leaned the rifle in the corner by the bed. She turned to him then, no hesitation in her voice. "I'm staying, not because I owe you, but because I want to." Luke looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Then we'll make this place ours." That night, with the shutters closed and the fire steady, they sat at the table, sharing bread and coffee. The threats were gone, the ridge was quiet, and the wolves were just another sound far off in the dark. For the first time since they met, there was nothing left to decide. Just the work ahead, the home they'd keep, and the life they'd build together. The story of Luke, Harlan, and Nayeli in the harsh, frost-bitten high desert delivers a powerful lesson about the courage to act on compassion, even when it means facing danger. Luke, a drifter scarred by loss and war, could have ridden past Nayeli, tied to a post as wolf prey, preserving his solitary life. Instead, he cut her free, choosing to protect her against her vengeful cousin and his men, driven by a quiet resolve to not let another soul be abandoned. Nayeli's defiance, refusing to beg, reclaiming her father's rifle, and standing beside Luke in battle, teaches us that strength is not just surviving, but asserting one's worth against those who seek to diminish it. Their partnership, forged through shared danger and mutual respect, shows that home is built not in isolation, but in the choice to stand together. This tale stirs deep emotions, urging us to reflect on moments when we can choose to help someone, even at great personal risk, and find purpose in the connections we forge. It challenges us to ask, when have we stood for someone or been saved by another's courage? Please share your thoughts in the comments. What does this story awaken in you? Have you ever found strength in standing with someone against the odds? Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to join our community for more stories that touch the heart and inspire us to embrace life's risks for the sake of others. Your support keeps these powerful narratives alive.